Squadron leader John Garstin held the Valiant B-1 steady at 45,000 feet as two silver shapes climbed into his 6 o'clock. The date was May 9th, 1956, and WZ-390 of 232 Operational Conversion Unit was probing the edge of Soviet-controlled airspace above the Baltic, part of a routine that RAF Bomber Command had been running with quiet regularity since the previous autumn. The MiG-17 Fresco was a newer aircraft than anything Garstin's crew had trained against. It could reach the Valiant's ceiling. That single fact, buried in Air Ministry telegrams filed at Q under AIR-20, undid a decade of assumptions about how Britain would fight the next war. The Valiant was the first of the V-Force to enter squadron service, delivered to 138th Squadron at RAF Gaydon in February 1955, under the direction of Air Chief Marshal Sir George Mills. It carried, or would soon carry, Britain's atomic deterrent, the Blue Danube freefall weapon, roughly 10,000 pounds of plutonium implosion device, designed at Aldermaston by William Penny's team. The doctrine was straightforward and, in retrospect, almost naive. Fly high, fly fast, drop the bomb, come home. High-altitude penetration was the entire logic of the aircraft's swept wing and its 4 Rolls-Royce Avon engines. If the Soviets could reach that altitude with a cannon-armed interceptor, the doctrine was already obsolete on the day the first squadron stood up. Whitehall did not want this known. The Joint Intelligence Committee circulated a restricted assessment in June 1956, JIC 5640, warning that Soviet air defense had materially advanced beyond the estimates made when the V-Force specification, B.35/46, had been drawn up in 1946. The paper went to the Chiefs of Staff and to Anthony Eden at Downing Street. Eden, distracted by the Egyptian crisis then building around NASA's threats to the canal, minuted only that the report should be shown to Duncan Sandys. Sandys was not yet Minister of Defence. He would be within 18 months, and the Defence White Paper he produced in April 1957 would carry the fingerprints of what the Valiant crews had seen over the Baltic that spring. Garstin's aircraft returned to RAF Wittering without incident. The MiGs had shadowed for perhaps 11 minutes, made no aggressive move, and peeled away as WZ-390 turned west. The debrief was conducted by Wing Commander Rupert Oakley, Station Commander at Wittering, and passed up the chain to Air Vice Marshal Kenneth Cross at No. 3 Group. Cross, a veteran of Bomber Command's wartime night offensive, understood immediately what the intercept meant. He had flown Lancasters against a Luftwaffe whose Me-262s had begun in 1945 to render the heavy bomber unsurvivable. He was watching the same clock start again, on his own force, from the other side. The intercept report was classified secret and filed. It was not shown to Parliament. It was not shown to the Cabinet Defence Committee in the form Cross had written it. What emerged months later was a sanitized summary that spoke of developments in Soviet air defense capability, without specifying the altitude at which those developments had been observed. The reason was not conspiracy, it was money. The V-Force had cost by 1956 something approaching £150 million at contemporary prices, and admitting that the Valiant could be caught at height meant admitting that the Victor and the Vulcan, still in development at Handley Page and Avro, might be caught too. Whitehall bought time by keeping the file shut. What it did with that time is the more interesting question. Sandys arrived at the Ministry of Defence in January 1957 with a brief from Harold Macmillan that was almost surgical in its directness. Reduce the defence estimates, cut national service, and rationalise the deterrent. Macmillan had taken Downing Street in the wreckage of Suez, and the Treasury under Peter Thornycroft was pressing hard. Britain was spending roughly 8.2% of gross national product on defence in 1956. The Americans, with a vastly larger economy, were spending about 10. Something had to give, and Sandys was the instrument chosen to give it. The white paper he laid before the Commons on April 4, 1957, Command 124, ran to 28 pages and rewrote British strategy. It committed the country to the hydrogen bomb, then in development at Aldermaston under Penny's successor programme, and to a ballistic missile deterrent as soon as one could be procured. It abolished national service by 1960. It slashed Fighter Command's projected front line. And it declared in a phrase that would haunt the air staff for a decade that manned aircraft were approaching the end of their usefulness as a means of delivering nuclear weapons. The Baltic intercepts sat beneath this document like a foundation stone nobody was allowed to see. The problem was that the missile did not yet exist. Bluestreak, the intermediate-range ballistic missile under development at de Havilland Propellers at Hatfield, was a liquid-fueled weapon requiring lengthy launch preparation from fixed silos. The JIC assessed in early 1958 that Soviet reconnaissance would locate the silos within months of construction, and Soviet missiles would strike them before Bluestreak could be fueled and fired. Solly Zuckerman, chief scientific advisor at the MOD from 1960, put it bluntly in a note to Sandys. The weapon was a sitting target. Bluestreak was cancelled as a military project in April 1960. The bill to that point was approximately £84 million. The V-Force, notionally obsolescent, remained the deterrent by default. What saved the V-Force temporarily was a change in doctrine forced by the Baltic evidence and by the U-2 shootdown over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960. If high-altitude penetration was dead, low-altitude penetration might live. Vulcan and Victor crews began training in 1963 to attack at 500 feet, following ground contours using terrain masking to defeat radar. The Valiant, structurally lighter and never designed for the stresses of low-level flight, began to break. In August 1964, metal fatigue was discovered in the rear spar of a Valiant of 543 Squadron at RAF Whiten. Inspections across the fleet found the same cracking in aircraft after aircraft. The type was withdrawn from service in January 1965, 9 years ahead of schedule. Dennis Healy, Wilson's defense secretary since October 1964, inherited the wreckage. He was 47, a former beachmaster at Anzio, and had done more thinking about nuclear strategy than any politician in cabinet. He had been to Rand. He had read Bernard Brodie and Herman Kahn. He understood walking into the office at Storey's Gate that the deterrent Britain had built was aging faster than its replacements were arriving, and that the Americans had already offered a way out. That way was Polaris, and the meeting where it had been agreed was already 3 years in the past. Nassau, December 1962. Macmillan met Kennedy at the Bahamas Conference from the 18th to the 21st, and the two men negotiated, at times without their advisers, the terms on which Britain would remain a nuclear power. The immediate trigger was the American cancellation of Skybolt, the air-launched ballistic missile that the RAF had been counting on to extend the V-Force into the 1970s. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's defense secretary, had killed the program on technical and cost grounds without warning London. The reaction in Whitehall was, in the words of Peter Thornycroft, then Minister of Defence, one of considerable dismay. That is a British phrase for fury. Macmillan, 68 and increasingly unwell, played the meeting with the skill of a man who understood exactly how much of his hand was theatre. He invoked Churchill. He invoked the wartime alliance. He told Kennedy that if Britain lost its independent deterrent, the government would fall, and any successor would be less pliant on Berlin, on Cuba, on the whole Western position. Kennedy, who had been in Washington through the missile crisis 2 months earlier, understood the currency being spent. He agreed to sell Polaris A-3 submarine-launched missiles to Britain on terms that were technically extremely generous. Britain would build the submarines, build the warheads, and buy only the missile bodies. The cost per boat was estimated at roughly £40 million. There would be 4 boats: Resolution, Repulse, Renown, Revenge. The catch, and there was one, was the assignment clause. British Polaris would be assigned to NATO except in circumstances where supreme national interests were at stake. That phrase, drafted by Foreign Office lawyers and accepted by the Americans without much argument, has been debated by historians ever since. Peter Hennessy has argued on the basis of documents released to the National Archives at Kew that the phrase meant precisely what it said and left London genuine independence. Lawrence Freedman has suggested the picture is more constrained, particularly on targeting, which depended on American data. What is not in dispute is that Nassau kept Britain in the deterrent business for another 30 years. Healy, taking office 2 years later, had to make it work. The submarines were being built at Vickers Armstrong at Barrow-in-Furness and at Camel Laird at Birkenhead. The reactors were built at Rolls-Royce and Associates in Derby, drawing on American technology transferred under the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement. The warheads, 3 per missile, each of approximately 200 kilotons yield, were designed at Aldermaston. The whole enterprise sat inside a security perimeter that GCHQ at Cheltenham monitored constantly for signs of Soviet penetration. It was, in the phrase that recurs in the Cabinet Office files, a national endeavour. It was also at the working level, a scramble. HMS Resolution, first of class, was laid down in February 1964, launched in September 1966, and commissioned in October 1967. Her first operational patrol from HMNB Clyde at Faslane began in June 1968. From that date forward, without interruption, Britain has maintained at least one submarine at sea carrying nuclear weapons under a system called Continuous at-Sea Deterrence. The V-Force had handed over. The Vulcans and Victors would soldier on as conventional bombers, and the Vulcan would fly one final combat mission in 1982 that nobody in 1968 could have predicted. What Faslane never spoke of publicly was how close the Soviets had come to knowing everything. The name in the file at MI5's Curzon Street headquarters was John Vassall, and the file grew steadily through 1961 and 1962. Vassall was a clerical officer at the Admiralty who had served at the British Embassy in Moscow from 1954 to 1956. The KGB had photographed him at a compromising party, blackmailed him, and turned him into a productive agent. Over 7 years he passed documents on naval anti-submarine warfare, on torpedo development, on the electronics fitted to the new nuclear submarine program. The material went to Moscow via a series of dead drops in London parks that MI5 watchers only fully identified after his arrest in September 1962. The Vassall case was one thread in a rope of penetration that ran through the entire Cold War. George Blake, the SIS officer arrested in 1961, had betrayed the identities of dozens of British agents in Eastern Europe, most of whom were executed. Blake was sentenced to 42 years, the longest sentence handed down in a British court, and escaped from Wormwood Scrubs in October 1966 with help from a peace activist named Sean Bork. He surfaced in Moscow. He is believed by historians, including Christopher Andrew, whose Authorised History of MI5 was published in 2009, to have compromised Operation Gold, the Berlin Tunnel, from its inception. What made the Blake case different from Vassall's was ideology. Vassall was coerced. Blake had converted in a North Korean prisoner of war camp between 1950 and 1953 to something like communism, though he later described it as opposition to Western imperialism rather than embrace of Stalinism. Kim Philby, whose defection to Moscow via Beirut in January 1963 completed the exposure of the Cambridge network, was ideological from Cambridge onwards. Anthony Blunt, unmasked internally in 1964 and publicly only in 1979 by Margaret Thatcher, had been surveyor of the Queen's pictures for 22 years, while acknowledged by the security service as a former Soviet agent. The damage cannot be quantified in the way that lost equipment can be quantified. Peter Wright, the MI5 officer whose 1987 memoir Spycatcher the Thatcher Government tried and failed to suppress, believed the penetration ran deeper than had been officially admitted. His hunt for a fifth man, pursued with obsessive energy through the late 1960s, settled eventually on Sir Roger Hollis, Director General of MI5 from 1956 to 1965. Hollis was formally cleared twice, and Wright's case against him is not accepted by most historians who have examined the surviving records. Andrew's official history describes the allegation as unfounded. The controversy nevertheless consumed the security service internally for a decade and poisoned relations with the CIA at senior level. The counter-effort was quieter and in its way more successful. Oleg Penkovsky, a colonel in Soviet military intelligence, was run jointly by SIS and the CIA from April 1961 until his arrest in October 1962. His material, over 5,500 exposures of documents, including the specifications of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, was delivered to a British case officer, Rory Chisholm, and to Chisholm's wife Janet, who met Penkovsky at receptions and Moscow department stores. What Penkovsky provided in the days before the Cuban Missile Crisis was the technical baseline that let Kennedy and Macmillan understand exactly what they were looking at when the U-2 photographs came in. Macmillan had asked Whitehall a question at the end of 1961. What did Britain actually know about Soviet nuclear forces? The answer arriving through Penkovsky was more than the Kremlin realized. Cuba, October 1962. The British role has been minimized in most American accounts and overstated in some British ones, and the truth sits between. Macmillan was at Admiralty House on the evening of October 21st, waiting for the American ambassador, David Bruce, to arrive with a personal letter from Kennedy. Bruce delivered it at around 11 p.m. The letter set out the photographic evidence of Soviet medium and intermediate-range missiles in Cuba, described the naval quarantine Kennedy would announce the following day, and asked for British public support. Macmillan read it, thought about it overnight, and rang Kennedy on the secure transatlantic line at around 11 a.m. on October 22nd, 1962. The transcripts of the Macmillan-Kennedy telephone conversations during the 13 days of the crisis were released to the National Archives at Kew in 1996, and are among the most extraordinary documents of the Cold War. Macmillan was calm, precise, and consistently urged restraint. He drew on his experience of the Berlin blockade, of Suez, and of a lifetime spent watching great powers stumble into wars they had not intended. Kennedy used him as a sounding board in a way he used almost no other Allied leader. Sir David Ormsby Gore, the British ambassador in Washington and a personal friend of Kennedy's, was inside the ex-com meetings at the White House throughout the crisis, an access unprecedented for a foreign representative. Britain's own nuclear forces went to an increased state of readiness during the crisis, though the historical picture is disputed. Peter Hennessy has argued, based on documents in the DEFE series at Kew, that Air Marshal Sir Kenneth Cross ordered the V-Force to a heightened alert without informing Downing Street, on his own judgment as Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command. Other historians, including Len Scott, suggest the order was more constrained and better coordinated with Whitehall than Hennessy's reading allows. What is not disputed is that, on October 27, 1962, the day a U-2 was shot down over Cuba, elements of the V-Force were dispersed, some aircraft cockpit-ready with weapons loaded, at bases including RAF Waddington, RAF Coningsby, and RAF Cottesmore. It was the closest Britain came to nuclear release during the Cold War. At the Foreign Office, Lord Home, soon to be Prime Minister, worked the diplomatic circuits, particularly through the United Nations, where Sir Patrick Deane, the UK permanent representative, coordinated closely with Adlai Stevenson. The public British posture supported Kennedy without reservation. The private British posture, transmitted through Ormsby Gore, was more nuanced, pressed for the quarantine to be lifted at the earliest possible moment, for direct communication with Khrushchev to be maintained, and against any airstrike option that might trigger uncontrolled escalation. The crisis ended on October 28th with Khrushchev's broadcast withdrawal of the missiles. In London, the mood was not triumphant. It was, according to the diary of Harold Evans, Macmillan's press secretary, deeply sober. Macmillan himself wrote in his own diary that the world had escaped this time by a hair's breadth. The following month saw the negotiation of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, signed in Moscow on August 5, 1963. Largely on Kennedy's initiative, but with British negotiators, Lord Hailsham led the delegation, playing an active technical role. The test ban did not end the arms race, it moved it. What it moved it towards was underground testing, submarine launch systems, and a technological competition that Britain alone could no longer afford to run. Healy's 4-year tenure at the MOD from 1964 to 1970 was defined by retreat and rationalization. East of Suez was abandoned in stages between 1966 and 1971, ending 3 centuries of British military presence in Aden, the Persian Gulf, and Singapore. The last British troops left Aden on November 29, 1967, in a withdrawal that Field Marshal Sir Michael Carver, then Director of Army Staff Duties, described in later memoirs as one of the more competent operations of the decade despite its melancholy character. Cyprus was retained, Hong Kong was retained until its predetermined handover, and everywhere else the flag came down. The reasoning was economic. The devaluation of sterling in November 1967, from $2.80 to $2.40, forced a fundamental review of what Britain could afford. Roy Jenkins at the Treasury and Healy at Defence produced a package that, taken together, reduced the armed forces to a NATO-focused structure. The Royal Navy's East of Suez commitments went. The projected replacement for the aging fleet carriers, a class called CVA-01, of which the lead ship would have been HMS Queen Elizabeth, was cancelled in the 1966 Defence Review. The Fleet Air Arms fixed-wing capability was in stages extinguished. What replaced it eventually was the through-deck cruiser concept, HMS Invincible, laid down at Vickers Barrow in 1973, launched in 1977, commissioned in 1980, and the Sea Harrier, a naval variant of the RAF's Harrier GR1, developed by Hawker Siddeley at Kingston. The Sea Harrier's genesis was contested inside Whitehall throughout the early 1970s. The Treasury opposed it. The Air Staff was ambivalent. The Naval Staff, led at various points by Admiral Sir Michael Pollock and Admiral Sir Edward Ashmore, pushed the project through against considerable resistance. The order for the first production aircraft was placed in 1975. Nobody involved in that decision knew that within 7 years the aircraft would be flying combat missions over 8,000 miles from home. The Army's reshaping was similarly wrenching. The British Army of the Rhine, 4 divisions strong on paper at the peak, was the tripwire that would fight the Third World War if it came. The 1st British Corps, headquartered at Bielefeld under commanders including Lieutenant General Sir John Mogg, was integrated into NATO's Northern Army Group and drilled endlessly against the anticipated Soviet armoured thrust through the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain. The Chieftain main battle tank, entering service from 1966, was the heaviest and most powerfully armed tank in NATO, but plagued by engine reliability problems that took a decade to resolve. Its 120mm L11 rifled gun was, however, the finest tank weapon of its generation. Underlying all of this was intelligence, and intelligence was increasingly signals-based. GCHQ at Cheltenham had grown, quietly, into one of the largest signals intelligence establishments in the world, sharing product with the Americans under the UK-USA Agreement of 1946 and its subsequent amendments. The stations at Cheadle at Chicksands, jointly with the USAF, and at RAF Menwith Hill in North Yorkshire, monitored Soviet military communications across Eastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union. What GCHQ produced was so sensitive that within Whitehall, its very existence was, until Duncan Campbell's 1976 article in Time Out, not publicly acknowledged. The 1970s were about hanging on. The 1980s would be about something else entirely. Margaret Thatcher, elected on May 3, 1979, brought to Downing Street a set of instincts about the Soviet Union that had been sharpened by conversations with Robert Conquest, with Hugh Thomas and with a Polish exile named Włodzimierz Rosenbaum. Her first major speech on foreign affairs at Kensington Town Hall on January 19, 1976, had earned her the sobriquet Iron Lady from a Soviet military newspaper, and she wore it with pleasure. Her defense policy was straightforward: rebuild the deterrent, honor NATO commitments in full, and confront Soviet expansion wherever it appeared. The deterrent decision came first. Polaris, dating from Nassau, was aging and would require replacement in the 1990s. Cabinet took the decision in July 1980 to buy the American Trident C4 system, subsequently upgraded to Trident D5 in 1982. The program cost over its lifetime would exceed £10 billion at 1980s prices. The submarines Vanguard, Victorious, Vigilant, Vengeance would be built at Vickers Barrow. Aldermaston would build the warheads. The decision was contested politically. Michael Foot's Labour Party campaigned in 1983 on unilateral nuclear disarmament and lost decisively. That election result, more than any diplomatic exchange, settled the domestic argument. The Falklands War from April to June 1982 was the operational proof of Thatcher's defence posture and, simultaneously, exposed the near-fatal underlying cuts. John Nott's Defence Review of June 1981 had proposed disposing of HMS Endurance, the ice patrol vessel that maintained a British presence in the South Atlantic, and had signalled reductions in the amphibious capability that would prove essential 10 months later. The Argentine junta under General Galtieri read those signals and invaded on April 2, 1982. The response of the task force dispatched under Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, commanded at sea by Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, improvised what the reviews had almost dismantled. The Vulcan flew again. Operation Blackbuck, mounted from Ascension Island by 44, 50 and 101 squadrons, saw a Vulcan B.2 crewed by squadron leader Martin Withers drop 21 1,000-pound bombs on the runway at Stanley on May 1, 1982. It was at the time the longest bombing mission in history, nearly 8,000 miles and requiring 11 Victor tanker sorties for the refueling. The military effect was limited, a single crater near the runway's centerline, but the strategic effect was substantial. Argentine Mirage fighters were withdrawn to defend Buenos Aires. Sea Harriers of 800 and 801 Naval Air Squadrons, flying from HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, dominated the air war above the fleet, downing over 20 Argentine aircraft for no air-to-air losses. The intelligence dimension has been examined at length. GCHQ intercepted Argentine naval communications throughout the campaign, including signals that gave forewarning of the Belgrano's movements before Woodward requested the change to rules of engagement that led to her sinking by HMS Conqueror on May 2nd. The decision to attack was Thatcher's, taken at Chequers on the recommendation of the Chiefs of Staff. 323 Argentine sailors died. The political controversy that followed, particularly around the ship's course at the moment of attack, ran through British politics for years and was pursued by the Labour MP Tam Dalyell with characteristic tenacity. Argentina surrendered on June 14, 1982. 255 British service personnel were dead. The Falklands proved that Britain could still project power. What it also proved to Thatcher and to her advisers was that the Cold War might not end militarily. Reagan arrived at the White House in January 1981, and Thatcher had a partner. Their first meeting had been at the House of Commons in April 1975, when neither held office and both had recognized in the other an ideological sympathy that would define the closing decade of the Cold War. Between 1981 and 1988, they met more than a dozen times. The transcripts of their conversations, released variously to the National Archives at Kew and the Reagan Library, show a relationship of unusual candor, in which Thatcher frequently pressed Reagan on strategic matters, where she thought his instincts required steadying. The deployment of ground-launched cruise missiles at RAF Greenham Common and at RAF Molesworth from November 1983 was the concrete expression of the alliance. The missiles were American, but the political cost was British. the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, established in September 1981 by a march from Cardiff, sustained a protest that lasted throughout the decade and reshaped the culture of British political dissent. The Cabinet Office monitored it. MI5 monitored elements of it, particularly where infiltration by declared communists was suspected. Michael Heseltine, appointed Defence Secretary in January 1983, became the government's public defender of the deployment and did the job with brutal effectiveness. The turning point in retrospect came in December 1984. Mikhail Gorbachev, then a candidate member of the Politburo, visited London at Thatcher's invitation and spent 3 days in conversations at Chequers and Downing Street. Thatcher's assessment, delivered to reporters and telegraphed immediately to Washington through the ambassador Sir Oliver Wright, was direct. "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." The phrase was calculated. It was intended for Reagan's ears, and it worked. Reagan's own engagement with Gorbachev, at Geneva in November 1985, at Reykjavik in October 1986, at Washington in December 1987, proceeded with Thatcher as constant interlocutor and occasional break. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed on December 8, 1987, removed an entire class of weapons from Europe. The cruise missiles at Greenham began to leave in 1988 and were gone by 1991. The peace camp remained until 2000 in a form, as a monument to itself. Britain had held the deployment line long enough for the Soviet system to recognize it could not match Western technology in a sustained arms race. The Strategic Defense Initiative announced by Reagan in March 1983, however implausible technically, had convinced Moscow that the competition was unwinnable. The Berlin Wall opened on the night of November 9, 1989. Thatcher watched the coverage at Downing Street and, according to Charles Powell's contemporary note, was more anxious than exhilarated. Her concerns about German reunification, expressed to François Mitterrand and to Gorbachev throughout 1989 and 1990, put her at odds with Bush's Washington and Kohl's Bonn. She lost that argument. Germany reunified on October 3, 1990. Thatcher fell from office on November 28, 1990. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 25, 1991. Britain had entered the Cold War in 1945 as one of the three victors, holding a global empire, an atomic monopoly in waiting, and a place at every table. It emerged in 1991 with the empire gone, the deterrent independent but American supplied, the economy reshaped, and the alliance with Washington closer than at any point in the century. What had been preserved was the capacity to act and the intelligence services, the deterrent and the professional armed forces to make action credible. The record of 46 years of maneuver inside a bipolar world was, for a nation of Britain's size, one of the more effective performances of the 20th century. The Baltic Intercept of May 1956 stayed in its file at Kew, declassified quietly in the 1990s, read by few and remembered by fewer. It was in its way where the argument had started.